the 7 deadly sins. They threaten to corrupt us all.
These are death-dealing sins. They will have a severely damaging effect on one's spiritual life.
Lust, envy, gluttony, sloth, greed, anger, and pride. According to Christian theology, committing these dreadful offenses can be as simple as merely contemplating them.
Scripture says the wages of sin is death.
Each of the sins has a secret history revealing how it came to be deadly. The 7 deadly sins have had an enormous impact on history, society, and also our individual souls.
You cannot transgress God's moral law without someone paying a terrible price.
And the sin that puts a price on everything is greed. The 7 deadly sins are an important element of Christian doctrine, yet they do not actually appear in the Bible. They first appeared in a remote monastery in the Egyptian desert, more than 300 years after the New Testament was written. A monk named Evagrius Ponticus retreated to its isolation from the hubbub of Constantinople. There, in about 375 AD, he began to catalogue the temptations that could endanger the soul, eventually compiling a list of the most dangerous. Evagrius believed he could refine his list to 8 terrible temptations. And greed was one of the worst. Evagrius wrote that greed arose from the famines that are sure to come, sickness that will visit us, and the pinch of poverty. The 7 deadly sins would not be codified until 590 AD, when Pope Gregory the Great re-examined the work of Evagrius. He decreased the number to 7, changed the name from temptations to sins, and proclaimed to all the faithful that they were deadly. In Gregory's view, the greedy man was a murderer. He wrote, "He who keeps for his own use what would provide for the poor is slaying all those who could have lived from his plenty." Greed is the excessive or rapacious desire for wealth or possessions. This transgression goes by many names, including covetousness, acquisitiveness, and avarice. It leads to forbidden activities like hoarding, cheating, corruption, and theft.
All people are susceptible to greed. All people across classes, types, and professions. Problems come when our possessions control us instead of us controlling our possessions.
Some of the earliest examples of the power of the sin of greed are found in the Old Testament book of Exodus. Moses brought God's 10 commandments down from Mount Sinai and gave them to the Jewish people. These basic laws and rules governing ethics would become the code by which the faithful promised to lead their lives. Some religious scholars think that the final commandment, "Thou shalt not covet," offers a perspective on all the other divine regulations.
The last one, which is covetousness, is not about an action. It's about a state of mind. And greed is a state of mind out of which all the others come.
In the commentary on ancient Jewish law called the Talmud, people become greedy or commit other sins because of their evil impulse, or Yetzer Hara. To counter the evil impulse towards such selfishness, the Talmud made caring and looking after others a fixed obligation.
In Judaism, every community has to have what's called a communal plate, essentially, a charitable fund. And so the idea from the very beginning was that people who had an obligation to give to people who didn't.
Judaism is not nearly as absorbed with individual sin as Christianity is. Judaism is concerned with sin because it interrupts the natural order and because the community, the people of God, are what matters.
But despite God's decrees and the sacred laws, the sin of greed prospered in the Holy Land. In 586 BC, the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem. In the book of Jeremiah, the prophet interprets this disaster as God's punishment on a people guilty of covetousness. He wrote, "I will give their wives to other men and their fields to new owners. From the least to the greatest, all are greedy for gain." The Old Testament was not the only ancient text to warn against greed. In 516 BC, the teachings of the Buddha were spreading over India. Buddhism talks extensively about greed. Upon reaching the state of nirvana, the Buddha laid out the four noble truths that are believed to contain the essence of his wisdom. The second truth is that suffering arises out of the craving for earthly possessions, or greed. Buddha's belief in karma led him to also believe that the greedy are punished by being reborn as starving spirits.
There is a realm called the world of the hungry ghosts, and these are beings who can't get their fill, and as a result, everything turns into inadequacy, disgust, crumbs.
By the 3rd century BC, Taoism had established a profound influence in China. The central Taoist text, the Tao Te Ching, attributed to the philosopher Lao Tzu, emphatically denounces the wickedness of greed.
The Tao Te Ching just outright says, greed is the source of all man's evil.
By the middle of the 4th century BC, one Mediterranean civilization was similarly contemplating the nature of avarice. The philosophers of classical Greece were fascinated by balance and equilibrium in architecture and everything else in life. Greed was considered an imbalance and an excess to be avoided. The legend of Midas was a popular story that graphically described the results of covetousness. Midas was a rich king who wanted to be even richer by turning whatever he touched into gold. But after the gods granted his wish, Midas accidentally turned his food, and even his daughter, into hard, unfeeling metal. He soon realized the error of his ways. Greek children who heard the tale of Midas grew up to contemplate the notion of greed profoundly. These children included Aristotle, the philosopher credited with formulating the first formal code of ethics in the classical world. Aristotle believed that in order to achieve a virtuous life, one must find the balance between excess and efficiency. He encouraged the idea of what he termed liberality, the virtue of giving to everyone as much as they deserved. But every virtue had its opposite.
If you have a deficit in your ability to give, you are what Aristotle calls avaricious. He means miserly.
Aristotle saw greed everywhere and commented, "The avarice of mankind is insatiable." By 27 BC, the glory of Greece had been superseded by the power of Rome. The Romans were masters of most of the known world, but many citizens feared that worldly success had corrupted their souls. The Roman author Horace analyzed the decadence he saw around him by detailing a list of 7 vices that plague society: avarice, love of praise, envy, anger, sloth, gluttony, and lust. An uncanny pagan premonition of the 7 deadly sins, with avarice, also known as greed, at the top of the list. Horace, however, did not believe that greed led to hell. Instead, he thought greed carried its own price in the form of never-ending hunger. Horace summed up the consequences in the maxim, "The more you acquire, the more you desire." Philosophers of the Roman Republic criticized greed dispassionately and without rancor. But in the generation after Horace, a figure arose whose anger at men's greed would echo down the centuries and forever change the way the world understood the 7 deadly sins. The 7 deadly sins. For centuries, they've shaped the behavior of the Christian world, but they have not been universally respected. Greed was tolerated and sometimes celebrated during the early days of the Roman Empire. Then, about 30 AD, in the Roman province of Galilee, an itinerant Jew preached against the vice, with words that carried a strange and potent authority. Jesus of Nazareth proclaimed, "Keep yourselves from covetousness, for a man's life consists not in the abundance of things he possesses." He summed up the stark choice when he asked, "What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and suffer the loss of his own soul?"
Jesus has little to say about the value of accumulating capital or accumulating money, but he has a great deal to say to the poor. And he says, "You are the ones that are blessed, not the wealthy." And this, of course, is patently false. We know that the lucky people around are the wealthy, not according to Jesus.
There really are, I'm sure, strong cultural reasons for Christianity's just disproportionate fascination with greed. And one of them, I think, is the fact that money and market comes along about the same time.
The Roman Empire's great port of Ostia gave it control over most of the fantastic growth in international trade during this period. Cargoes of food, wine, salt, slaves, and more flowed into Rome from its far-flung provinces. It seemed that the more Romans got, the more they wanted. The result was taxation.
The Romans, they had an interesting way of doing things. First of all, they would invade you, and then they would charge you for the invasion. They never collected taxes themselves, lest it become a riot. So they had locals who were the sellouts collect tax.
What one has to bear in mind is that tax collectors made their money by overcharging. The only way that a tax collector had any income of his own was by charging more than the government required. So tax collectors would always charge people more and would end up amassing wealth by effectively preying on the weak, preying on the poor. And Jesus' condemnation of tax collectors is primarily those who are preying on their own brothers and sisters and turning the money over to a foreign government.
But Jesus directed his greatest anger at the moneylenders of the temple in Jerusalem. These men exchanged Roman currency for the local shekels Jews needed to buy sacrificial animals, and for this service, they charged a fat fee.
Effectively, they're the equivalent of scalpers at an athletic game or at a show, who are charging much more than would be charged if you were to, say, buy the same animal somewhere else and bring it to the temple.
They're making a profit on it. Jesus says that you turn it into a den of thieves. Not only are you doing business, you're doing crooked business.
The sin of greed played a significant role in the death of Jesus. When he was betrayed to the authorities by his disciple Judas, it was for cash.
30 pieces of silver wasn't a lot of money. And that he was willing to sell Jesus out for that shows you, in the clutch, it's amazing what we'll sell out for.
When Jesus was crucified, sometime between 26 and 36 AD, all the avaricious souls might have been relieved, but his followers took up the attack on this particular vice with a vengeance. It's commonly thought that Jesus said, "Money is the root of all evil." But the assertion actually appears in the New Testament first letter to Timothy, attributed to the Apostle Paul. His famous phrase, written in Greek, has sometimes been mistranslated.
What Paul actually says is that the love of money is the root of all evil.
There's nothing wrong with money. It's the obsessive love of money that is the root of all evil. Greed cuts us off from our fellow human beings.
Paul's saying was translated into Latin as radix omnium malorum avaritia, which in English means the root of all evil is avarice.
Somewhere around the end of the 4th century, they began to stack it like an acrostic. So you had radix here, and then you had omnium, Valorem, Avaritia, and what you've got is R-O-M-A. And it was their way of making a political statement, and you'll find it on some walls as graffiti.
Roma, the Latin name for Rome, became a covert criticism of the empire, which its subjects, Christians in particular, believed had been corrupted by all manner of wickedness. Some Christians sought escape from the violence and decadence of the Roman world in enclosed monasteries, often in remote locations. In such a monastery, a monk, Evagrius Ponticus, would create the first Christian list of deadly sins, his 8 patterns of evil thoughts. Evagrius considered the sin of greed especially dangerous because it concerned the fear of the future.
You found a lot of monks taking a vow of poverty, and there was a temptation to kind of keep some of that back because you need something to take care of you in your old age. But the problem with greed is this accumulation of more, and more is never enough. How much do you need when you want more?
Often, possessions are a way of protecting ourselves against uncertainty, but ultimately we're destined for an existence that reaches beyond this life and beyond anything that we need to protect ourselves against. So there's a danger in investing too much energy in or according too much power to money.
Evagrius's list of 8 evil thoughts was little known outside monastic circles. But in 400 AD, a contemporary of his, a lawyer turned ascetic named Prudentius, took a similar list of transgressions and from them created an epic work, the Psychomachia, or Soul Battle. The book is a complex allegory of the conflict between vice and virtue that rages inside us all.
The Psychomachia really informed for almost 1,000 years Christian lay thought.
Prudentius visualized each vice and virtue as a dramatic character who can speak, feel, and act.
Prudentius was a genius. For the first time, he personified the sin, and that's part of what's significant here.
In the Psychomachia, vices and virtues fight to the death in an epic battle. The personification of the abstract moral qualities allowed ordinary people to more clearly understand the spiritual stakes involved. Several vices are defeated, and they flee the battlefield, dropping their weapons, jewels, and gold. The mortally wounded are left to die, lying in their own blood. Smoldering flesh litters the ground. At this point, the sin of greed, personified as a haggard old crone, enters the scene.
Here comes this stark thing, and she has, Prudentius says, claw-like hands. And she begins to go in under the dead bodies and under the routed forces and pull up all of the fruit of the battle.
Prudentius writes, "Of all the vices, there is none more frightening. With her arms full of the spoils of war, greed spies a group of priests on the battlefield coming to help the virtues. She tries to tempt them to abandon their vow of poverty, but the priests resist her. Seeing that the battle can't be won in this fashion, greed resorts to deceit and transforms her grotesque appearance into something young and lovely.
And she cleans herself up, and she puts on a new dress, and she becomes Thrift.
As Thrift, she pretends that her avaricious behavior is only zealous concern for her children's welfare. But ultimately, the trick is unsuccessful, and she dies. The Psychomachia ends with the virtues comprehensively defeating the vices. But the concept of greed would continue to thrive, even as the Roman Empire collapsed in ruins. For centuries, the Roman Empire had embraced all the wickedness we know as the 7 deadly sins and tried to ignore the consequences. But it was too late. The once mighty Rome had drowned in debt, and her overstretched empire had degenerated into disarray. Greed and the other vices had helped to undermine the most powerful state in the history of the world. Europe slipped imperceptibly into the Dark Ages.
The aqueducts were no longer properly working. The sewer system would back up every year and plague would break out. It's a little like the post-nuclear Holocaust Australia of the Mad Max films.
In 590 AD, it was only the authority of the Catholic Church that was holding Western society together. In this anxious and chaotic year, Gregory the Great transformed Evagrius Ponticus's earlier grouping of temptations for monks to avoid into the list of sins we know today. Lust, envy, gluttony, sloth, greed, anger, and pride. The 7 deadly sins were finally codified and published, and all good Christians would need to fear them and commit them at their peril.
From the point of view, I think, of the church, you can't really be ethical unless you're accountable to some standard. To a person of the church, ethics must be based on the accountability to God.
The Christian tenets were soon echoed in a new religion that arose at this time, Islam. The Quran, written by the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century, is the central text of the Muslim faith. It tells its followers that the quest to control base instincts like greed is vital for the attainment of spiritual purity.
There's a metaphor in the Islamic tradition of a person who is greedy is someone who's stooped over with the burden of carrying around these things, and a person who's upright is free from greed.
Muslims and Christians fought each other throughout the Middle Ages, especially for control of the Middle East, centered on Jerusalem. The Crusades were promoted with virtuous slogans shouted from both sides, but greed took up the cross as well. In an age when wealth necessitated the ownership of territory, conquering the Holy Land also presented a chance to get rich. Perhaps the greatest of the English Crusaders, King Richard the Lionheart, met his death because of his desire for wealth. In 1199, he attacked a castle in France searching for treasure. He sent an army to seize the gold, and in the ensuing siege, Richard received an arrow in the neck. He died of gangrene, but the real cause of death was his overweening desire for the gold. The punishments for avarice were many and often grisly. In 1306, an English army attacked Scottish rebels at Kildrummy Castle by bribing a Scots blacksmith named Osborne. He set a fire that destroyed the defenders' food supply. The English force took the castle, and Osborne demanded his reward, as much gold as he could carry. The English commander, disgusted by Osborne's treachery, melted the gold and poured it down his throat. This gruesome punishment was echoed in the same period when the Italian Dante Alighieri began his masterpiece, The Divine Comedy. This hugely influential work depicted nightmarish consequences for people who broke God's rules.
Our notion of hell is not basically scriptural. It's Dantean.
The story begins with a vision in which Dante meets Virgil, the Roman writer of the 1st century BC, who guides him into the pit of hell. There, he observes what happens to sinners. Down in the 4th circle of hell, Dante finds the greedy. They stumble back and forth forever, shoving huge weights that are as heavy as the gold they tried to acquire in life. Dante calls them ill-givers and ill-keepers, the hoarders of money and the squanderers of wealth. These wicked souls represent two sides of the same coin of greed, each unable to control their money. Then Dante and Virgil descend further into hell, to the 8th circle. Here he finds the corrupt priests who have committed the sin of greed by selling indulgences. Indulgences were essentially letters from the Pope granting forgiveness for offenses committed against God. A person would have to pay for an indulgence. It was supposed to shorten or even eliminate time in purgatory after death. This potentially corrupt transaction meant that greed had become an accepted part of church practice. In hell, Dante punishes the priests who profited from selling salvation by sticking them upside down in the ground, their feet on fire, in an excruciating reversal of the ritual of baptism. Then Dante and Virgil move on to purgatory, the place of torment for those whose sins are serious but can be forgiven. In Catholic doctrine, purgatory is seen as a place where sins are purged. The evildoers must suffer horribly, but eventually they will be rewarded with the promise of heaven.
When Dante gets to purgatory, the first thing he sees is those who are able to be in purgatory because of the sin of avarice are lying face down in the dirt, repeating a psalm verse, Psalm 119. My soul adheres to the dust. They're face down in the muck of the earth. They can't turn their eyes up the mountain of purgatory to where heaven is to see God. And so that is the ultimate comment that Dante makes on what the sin of avarice is.
Dante's Divine Comedy helped shape public attitudes towards sin for the next 1,500 years. But the fear it engendered wasn't enough to cleanse the Church of greed, especially in the form called simony. Simony was the taking of payment for priestly dues, such as confession.
In many ways, it's the ugliest form of greed. When the established religion, when the institution itself begins to deal in greed, there is no redeeming value.
During the Middle Ages, an idea took shape, that the reason some of the faithful committed sin was because they became possessed by demons. Greed had become so widespread that it got its own demon. The fiend's name was Mammon. Christians knew the name from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus had warned,
"You can't serve two masters, Mammon and God. You have to pick one or the other."
In the time of Jesus, Mammon, an Aramaic word, meant riches or property. That definition changed in the Middle Ages.
This term becomes synonymous with a demon.
In the study of demonology, Mammon was reborn in Christian thought as a literal devil, the hell-spawned demon of greed, the enemy of charity, and the destroyer of peace. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, the sin of greed seemed everywhere in evidence. The virtues of a modest life had waned as the frugal values of the early Christian monasteries had declined. In 1557, Peter Bruegel the Elder, the celebrated Flemish painter, depicted the sin of greed in the painting Big Fish, Eat Little Fish.
What you've got is the clear statement that, of course, that's how it is. Little fish are there to be eaten so bigger fish can eat them, so the system will work.
By the 18th century, the Western world was beginning to re-examine its ideas about greed and brought about the next step in its evolution. This was capitalism. In 1776, a Scottish economist called Adam Smith published his examination of commerce, The Wealth of Nations. It revolutionized the way people viewed money and how they felt about acquisitiveness.
Americans think that just one thing happened in 1776, and that is the Declaration of Independence. Actually, something else happened, very significant, and in the history of the world, perhaps as significant as the Declaration of Independence, and that was the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Now, this book was the first document to lay out the principles of economics and to lay out the case that capitalism, economics, self-interested behavior by individuals, acquisitiveness, even greed, might be good.
Smith, often called the father of modern economics, first wrote about greed in his work of 1759, The Theory of Moral Standards. He wrote then of the apparent benefits to society of people operating in their own interests, conceiving a world where the theory of economics was guided by an invisible hand.
The invisible hand is self-interest. It's greed, the motivator of trade and transactions. We trade away something that we value less to get something that we value more.
Adam Smith assumed that through what he called the invisible hand of millions of people functioning in a selfish way, wanting things that they wanted through the market, that everything would work out fine.
Smith explored this idea further in Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, where he wrote of the pursuit of self-interest, saying specifically that humans were driven by selfishness.
The important thing about greed in economics is that greed is taken as a given, that people have a motive to consume more stuff. And the argument in economics is you can harness greed for the social good through free markets, free and competitive markets.
But an ugly extension of market economics and the lure of greed developed at the same time, in the form of the slave trade. It's been estimated that on the long voyage between Africa and the New World, between 10% and 20% of black slaves and white crew members died. That was considered the acceptable cost of a profitable business enterprise. By the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution brought about another change in our understanding of greed, in the creation of an urban underclass. The American Civil War ended slavery on farms, but a new class of the exploited poor found themselves working in terrible conditions in city factories. At the end of the 19th century, the United States emerged as the most prosperous nation on the planet. It also brought into being a rapacious gang of profiteers who became infamously known as the robber barons. This group of bankers and businessmen amassed vast fortunes through unethical and anti-competitive business practices.
The robber barons, they owned the railroads, they owned the banks. They own so much of America that our freedoms are being constrained and endangered.
One of the most notorious and unscrupulous of these men was Jay Gould. This New York financier and railway company owner gained his unedifying reputation in 1869 when he devised a brilliant plan to manipulate the commodities market. First, Gould persuaded President Ulysses S. Grant to stop the government selling gold. Meanwhile, he secretly bought up vast amounts of gold in an effort to corner the market. The price of gold skyrocketed, impacting on the commodities market and dramatically raising the price of wheat. Gould had calculated that the increase in the price would force West Coast farmers to ship more grain to the east on his trains. Gould controlled it all: the wheat, the trains, and the gold. Unfortunately for him, President Grant got wind of the scheme and instructed the government to sell $4 million worth of gold immediately, effectively killing the inflated prices. Gould's plan hit the buffers. Gould's friendship with the infamously avaricious New York politician William Boss Tweed allowed him to escape jail. Committing the sin of greed didn't seem to affect Gould in this life. When he died, his fortune was estimated at $72 million. That's more than 1.6 billion in today's money, equivalent to 964 million pounds.
Capitalism has always had within it the seeds of excess. And it necessitates people being, to some extent, ambitious and selfish and, yes, greedy.
The gilded and guilty age of the robber barons did not last long. President Theodore Roosevelt, along with the Supreme Court, enacted antitrust laws that attacked the men he called malefactors of great wealth.
We want a capitalist system, but we don't want one that is so concentrated in so few hands. And so, for example, the first decades of the 20th century, we had a progressive era. We had antitrust laws that broke up the big concentrations of wealth, the oil companies and the railroad companies.
In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered millionaire John D. Rockefeller to break up his Standard Oil Company, a monopoly that controlled 70% of American refineries. Standard Oil divided into 34 separate companies. Stock in the new businesses rose sharply, and since Rockefeller held stock in all of them, his personal fortune tripled. Rockefeller became the richest man in the world. The moment would prove a watershed in the evolution of our understanding of excess. As the United States grew ever more powerful over the course of the 20th century, the concept of greed would change forever. The perception of the 7 deadly sins has evolved over time. No transgression has altered more profoundly than greed. The 20th century would become the century of greed, but it was a bumpy ride. The stock market crash of the 29th of October 1929 ushered in the Great Depression. One of the main causes is thought to have been the ill-regulated banking system that allowed a few entrepreneurs to gain tremendous wealth to the detriment of the mass of ordinary people.
Gambling in the stock market, I think, is motivated by greed and in self-interest. So there are people trying to turn a small amount of money into a lot of amount of money and are simply willing to take a chance.
But when the market crashed, it took down the rest of the economy with it. The sin of greed had almost ruined America. One result of the crash was widespread distrust of big business. A wave of economic and social reforms ensued. The stock market underwent many ups and downs over the following 50 years and has seen massive upheavals again recently, partly as a result of the excesses of the 80s.
We had the 1980s and 90s, and perhaps you could say this century so far, the 21st century, where we celebrate not only the mavericks and the entrepreneurs, but we celebrate the people who have acquired huge amounts of money and basically control everything.
The 1980s were labeled the decade of greed even before the 1990s arrived. The US was at the forefront as President Ronald Reagan's laissez-faire economic policy lowered taxes, cut social spending, and deregulated business.
Greed can undermine politics. The rich corporations, they get benefits for themselves, subsidies, corporate welfare, tax breaks.
The film Wall Street, released in 1987, may have summed it up best when the leading character, Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas, announced, "Greed is good." And Americans seem to agree. Today, 50% of Americans own stocks or shares.
We're going to strike it rich someday, and therefore we're going to invest in some stocks. But millions of people are trying to beat the market at the same time. They can't, because they are the market.
Scripture asserts that greed is wicked, but many scientists insist that it is normal and natural, not the temptation of the devil, but the prompting of our own neurology.
Every action that we take is based on the firing of neurons in our brain.
MRIs and sophisticated technology can reveal exactly what happens when the human brain turns avaricious.
Let me just define greed as wanting a lot of stuff, basically. We know a lot about wanting a lot of stuff, and that when you get something, you get a squirt of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. It makes you feel good. Animals will press levers that'll bump up their dopamine and, in fact, eventually kill them. They'll just keep pressing the lever.
So why don't you just go ahead, click on start?
Okay. The bigger the balloon, the more money that you get.
Exactly.
Okay.
In this behavioral risk test, subjects inflate a computer-generated balloon. The bigger it gets, the more money they get. But if the subject gets too greedy, the balloon pops and they lose everything.
The question is not greed or no greed. The question is how much greed. How do we tame greed? How do we make sure greed actually works for all of us?
To study how acquisitiveness influences business negotiations, Penn State University economist Dr. Gary Bolton uses a fascinating test called the ultimatum game.
The game involves two bargainers, and they're seeking agreement on how to divide $20. I might propose to you that you receive $5, and so I would keep $15 for myself. You can accept or reject that $5. If you accept it, The pie is split accordingly, 15-5. And if you reject it, we both walk away with nothing. That's it. Those are the rules. No do-overs, just play one time.
Almost half of those making offers show self-interested zeal and propose the lowest possible amount. About the same percentage of responders accept the smallest offer, as long as they get something. Perhaps both sides are greedy, but some are less ambitious. However, about 10% take a different approach. They insist on a 50-50 split and are willing to walk away with nothing rather than accept what they consider an unfair offer.
I think that everyone should get the same amount of money, regardless.
This group appears to reject greed out of hand. But are they truly renouncing it? Or is it just a question of how it is defined?
It may be the case that the traditional notion of greed for material things simply needs to be enlarged. That people want material things, but they also want social standing. They want to be treated fairly. They want a lot of things for themselves.
Wanting something. That desire is the spark that either the devil or DNA can fan into the acid yellow flame of the sin of greed.
But I do think that greed is a trait that all people share, and therefore I think it's just part of our biological makeup.
But if science proves that greed is merely a part of our DNA, does that mean we have no control over it? Pope Gregory the Great and Evagrius Ponticus insisted that greed is, and always will be, evil. Robber barons and Hollywood icons have, in effect, said greed is desirable, which is correct. No matter which answer you prefer, one thing remains true.
That's greed. You're never going to defeat her.